I first ran for and was elected to the Oregon Senate in 1976. Before I ran, joined a club called the Campaigners that met every, I think, Wednesday morning in a office building downtown called Standard Plaza in a little cafe. And there was a meeting room off the edge of this cafeteria or cafe that was mostly for employees that worked in that building. But we'd meet there at, I can't remember, 7:30 in the morning, some ungodly early hour. And it was structured, the club was structured like Toastmasters. And we would have a speaker, but we would also have what they call table topics. And each of us was expected to speak for like a minute and a half on this, whatever the topic of the day was, for us to improve our speaking skills. We would then have discussions, critique each other's speeches, and talk about politics of the day. It was partly just a big gossip session about current politics in Oregon. That gave me a lot of practice and head start on running for the state senate. And in that club, I think when I got elected, there were like 5 of us that won either House or Senate seats that were active members of that club. There was Frank and Barbara Roberts, who were the stars. Frank had been in the Senate sometime already by then, and Barb got elected to the House the session after I did. And there was Steve Kafori, and I won't list off all the members of the club that were running for the legislature, but it was a political hotbed. And in those gossip sessions, I learned a lot about what was going on in the Oregon legislature. Not near as much as I thought I was learning. When I got there, I found out that there was a lot I hadn't learned, but I did learn that the president of the Senate at the time, a man named Jason Bowe, a optometrist from Reedsport, was very conservative and very powerful. And they wanted to, he'd been president of the Senate already a couple of sessions, and they wanted to upend him and put a Portlander in, or at least a Willamette Valley senator in his place. I didn't learn until I got there that that was not a project that was likely to work. But I signed up to be a good urban liberal Democrat, and when I was asked by the newspaper, when I got the one interview I got before the election, would you be likely to support Jason Bowe to be president of the Senate again? I said no, I would not. I wanted an urban person who would be supportive of the Democratic platform, which he was not, on environmental issues, labor issues, women's issues, gay rights, a number of issues that he came down on the conservative side, and the members of our campaigners and the Willamette Valley Democrats were on the other side. After I got elected, I got sued by the fellow I defeated, who had spent one session already in the Senate, and had showed himself to be less than courageous in standing up for the Democratic platform. And he, I think, with the urgings of the Senate president and a few of the business lobbyists who wanted Jason Bowe to continue as Senate president because he was very pro-business, they hired a lawyer and sued me. And they said that I had said something that was untrue in the campaign, and that for that reason I should not be seated. And the thing they said that I said that was untrue was I put in my one campaign piece of literature that I could afford that my opponent had accepted an $800 contribution from a conservative Republican business group, three contentions, conservative Republican business group. And he wasn't really quarreling with conservative or business, but he said it was not a Republican group. Well, the group was called Oregonians for Free Enterprise, and it had been set up by a group of lobbyists because they were giving up on getting more Republicans elected, and they thought it was time Republicans who typically are business oriented, they decided to try and give money to and woo Democrats and get them to support their business priorities. And in the process, they pissed off their executive director, and he quit and went and told the Willamette Week, the somewhat liberal weekly newspaper in Portland, that this group was a sham, because while they had a board of like 10 that had two members were Democrats, they had an executive committee that was making all the decisions, and it was made up entirely of Republican lobbyists. So it was on paper a bipartisan group, but indeed, in essence, it was a Republican group. And I read the article in the Willamette Week and based my statement in my campaign literature on that Willamette Week article. And the trial was hilarious because I got my very first client that I'd gotten in October of '75, named Jerry Jelinek, to go with me, and we went to the 3 or 4 counties where the lobbyists lived, and he would go in and get a photocopy of their registration card, which was a public record. And we collected those up, and when the trial started, they put on their case, but when we put on our defense, I had subpoenaed 10, I think it was, lobbyists who were on the executive committee of Oregonians for Free Enterprise. And we brought them up one at a time and got them to sit down in the witness chair and said, you know, your name, are you on the executive committee of Oregonians for Free Enterprise? Yes, yes. What's your political party? Republican. And when we got about to the 5th one, of course, we had mentioned in our opening statement what we were going to be proving. Well, by the time we got to about the 5th lobbyist, the jurors were tittering. And of course, the plaintiffs, my fellow I defeated, and his lawyer had every opportunity to bring somebody in and to say they were indeed also on the executive board, and they were a Democrat. But what they did do is they brought one of the 2 titular Democrats who were on the broader committee that didn't have any power, and that was Edith Green, our U.S. Congresswoman, and she angrily testified that it was people like Jan Wyers who were ruining the country and not being respectful, and well, I'm remembering what happened in the trial. My lawyer had been the treasurer for Bobby Kennedy for president in 1968, before Bobby was murdered, and Edith Green had been the chair of Bobby Kennedy for president. So they had worked together on the Kennedy for President committee. And when she got around to saying something about people like Jan Wyers who were attacking people who had worked their way up in life and achieved some stature, and then people like Jan Wyers were attacking them, my lawyer jumped up, and the only time in the entire my court experience I saw a lawyer do this, he didn't even address the judge. He just said, "Mrs. Green, you know that's not true. Bobby Kennedy comes from 2 generations of wealth. He's not some working person that worked his way up and then somebody maliciously attacked him." And the jury was like, whoa. It wasn't probably the turning point in the case. The turning point in the case came when Frank Roberts, who was not a lawyer, he was a speech professor at Portland State University, told me, "Jan, the Constitution says that the legislature shall be the final judge of the, quote, qualifications and returns, how well they were elected, of its members, not the court." And he kept bugging me about that, and finally I went and did some reading and wrote a motion to dismiss part of the lawsuit and brought it in and handed it to my lawyer, and he wasn't very interested. He just wanted to win the case, but he did present it to the judge. The judge called a recess a little later and went down the hall. I found out later, conferred with a former state legislator from Medford and asked him, "Hey, what's the deal about this?" And came back and said, "This motion is correct. This is not a jury trial about whether Mr. Wyers should be able to be seated as a senator. That's up to the legislature. All we can talk about is if he did indeed say something that was untrue, we can talk about awarding some damages to make him pay for some of the campaign expenses of his opponent, but that's the limit of what this trial can do." So after that, the trial was merely a shell, and when it finished up though, after all those Republican lobbyists had come in and said, "Yes, I'm a Republican," the jury deliberated for 20 minutes and came in with a decision in my favor. But that was not a warm and fuzzy introduction for me into the state senate. And when I got there, all these lobbyists who'd been disrupted, their strategy had blown up on them. They weren't very happy with me, and the Republican legislators weren't happy with me either, particularly the future governor, Vic Tia, who at that time was the Republican leader in the Senate. In their little group of 6 in 1974, 2 years before I got elected, Richard Nixon was run out of the White House, and the Republicans who had supported him pretty much to the last ditch in the impeachment efforts were embarrassed, and the voters were mad at Republicans because Nixon was such a prominent representative of the Republican Party. So they took a drubbing in the 76 election, and they ended up down there in Salem with only 6 senators. There were 24 Democrats. And it looked like the Democrats were going to be in control. We had a Democrat as governor, Bob Straub. But when we got there, the rural Democrats and the Republicans had quietly coalesced, and the big issue of the session was field burning. And the governor was from Eugene, where field burning was a big issue because when the grass seed growers, and I think some huge percentage of all the grass seed for golf courses and lawns and so on is raised in the Willamette Valley, they would want to burn the stubble at the end of the growing season, and the smoke, if they didn't figure out the wind just right, or if it shifted on them unexpectedly, huge billows of black smoke would roll into the city of Eugene. So the city people wanted to stop that, and the rural people thought that was a great incursion on their freedoms. And now, years later, it's not an issue anymore. They're not burning the stubble, and they're doing just fine. But at the time, it was almost a religious thing, a fight between the town and the country. And the governor, being from Eugene, and a Democrat, so he was listening to the environmentalists. He wanted to not eliminate, but he wanted to restrict field burning. And the Speaker of the House from Portland was totally on board with that. So they started out the session, and the Speaker of the House, Phil Lang, made a very foolish decision to pack the committee chairmanships with urban people. He didn't balance it up to give the rural people a fair share of the power. So they organized a revolt, and Jason Bowe was meeting secretly at breakfast time with the people who were planning the mutiny. And one of the humorous sidelights of it, there was a young woman named Patricia, and I don't remember her last name, but she was from Africa, and she was very African, and she used to tell me, after this was all over, I would run into her, and she told me, well, you white people, we Africans, we're known for, you think we're all a bunch of cannibals, but she said, when you white people, when you get together and you start scheming and planning, you can be pretty vicious. And she'd laugh. But at any rate, they eventually had their coup, and they stripped the Speaker of the House of all of his power as to signing bills to committee, deciding which bills came to the floor when, and all he got to do was stand up there as a figurehead with a gavel. And in the midst of all that, I was over there learning how to be a state senator and operating in a functioning minority. The fellow who is in the obituary today was from Corvallis, and he supported Jason Bowe out of a great sense of practicality. As I look back at it all these years, he was smart to do what he did, because his number one objective was to get funding for Oregon State University, where he was a history professor, and the budget was controlled by Jason Bowe and the rural and Republican legislators. So he cuddled up to the power, but it was a constant frustration to me trying to get our democratic agenda done. But before we get there, I've gotten ahead of myself. When I first got down there, it was time to decide who was going to be president of the Senate that session. And one of the things that frustrated me so much was we had 3 of our urban senators, all of whom wanted to become president. And they didn't get together and knock their heads together and agree on one. It ended up, sort of by default, that we pushed forward Frank Roberts, who was a speech professor at Portland State, here in Portland, and eloquent speaker, but he had no skills in going around lining up, twisting arms and lining up support to be president of the Senate. He needed, for example, Cliff Trow, who was a professor like he was, with very similar kinds of political beliefs and inclinations and temperament, although there was a little catch there in that Frank was a little bit, what shall we say, liberal on sexual matters, and Trow was conservative in that way. But at any rate, they couldn't get the votes together to choose Frank Roberts or Keith Burbidge or Betty Roberts. It turned out that Betty Roberts, who later became the first woman Supreme Court judge in Oregon, very soon thereafter, circled around and made a deal with Jason Bowe in secret, and she was a major obstacle to our getting enough votes to choose Frank, her ex-husband. I mentioned morality sort of thing. Betty Roberts fell in love with a legislator from Eugene named Keith Skelton during either the 75 or the 73 session before I got there. And they broke up Frank and Betty broke up very publicly, and immediately she was seen with Keith Skelton, and it was clear that they were in a love affair, and that's what had ended her marriage to Frank. And then Frank very suddenly hooked up with a young, pretty blonde woman from Selwood, Portland, named Barbara Roberts. And the more conservative legislators who'd been married for 30, 40 years and were not comfortable with seeing people hopping from one bed to another so rapidly, that was one of Frank's stumbling blocks. But at any rate, they couldn't get together and really fight for Frank. And it was very frustrating for me, having had some experiences in my past of lobbying people to get people to do things. I could see if you couldn't focus on one person and all get together and fight for him, your chances weren't very good. And so we kind of embarrassed ourselves. We delayed the session starting for several days while we argued about who was going to be the president of the Senate. But it ended up that Jason Bowe got chosen again by a pretty good vote, because on the floor, when you actually choose the president, both parties get to vote. So he had started out with 6 Republicans, and then he just needed 10 Democrats, and he did that. So there I was, a freshman, liberal, and I'd stated to the paper that one of my big issues was going to be to fight against nuclear power. We had a nuclear power plant called the Trojan plant, and there was effort afoot to build a second one. And in fact, the siting council had agreed to site it, but then there was an appeal, and the Supreme Court said, no, you didn't follow the standards, and you were supposed to go through the procedures to cite it, of finding out things, make sure everything was all planned properly. So they sent it back to the circuit court for further review, and the plan was delayed. And then they came to the legislature to jam through the citing without too much continued concern for the citing council. And I had announced that would be a major issue for me. So there I was with a group that had tried to topple the king, and then I wanted to fight on a piece of legislation that the utility companies and the banks who get to lend the money to build a nuclear plant at cost plus were very unhappy with me. And so I got started out on a tenuous basis, which I'll talk more about in another reel soon.